Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Monday, July 29th, 2024. President Joe Biden proposes term limits, an enforceable ethics code for Supreme Court justices, and a constitutional amendment that says former presidents do not have immunity from criminal prosecution. We'll hear from the president and talk about it with Axios senior editor Sam Baker. In this year's presidential campaign, Vice President Kamala Harris, the likely Democratic nominee, focusing on a new abortion law in Iowa. And former President Donald Trump, Republican nominee, tells a crowd in Minnesota that he will fix everything they see wrong in the Biden-Harris administration. White House spokesperson John Kirby says there is confidence that there will not be a full-scale war between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon after a rocket fired from Hezbollah killed a dozen children playing soccer in the Golan Heights. Secretary of State Antony Blinken says of the official results of Sunday's presidential election in Venezuela, proclaiming the reelection of Nicolas Maduro, we have serious concern that the result announced does not reflect the will or the votes of the Venezuelan people. Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass goes to the Summer Olympics in Paris, thinking about the 2028 Summer Games, which her city will host. And Alma Powell, wife of the late Secretary of State Colin Powell, has died. C-SPAN 2's Book TV spoke to her 20 years ago about her book, America's Promise. President Joe Biden posting on X, "This nation was founded on a simple yet profound principle. No one is above the law, not the President of the United States, not a justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. So today I'm calling for 3 bold reforms to restore trust and accountability to the court and our democracy. 1, no more immunity for crimes a former president committed while in office. 2, term limits for Supreme Court justices. 3, a binding code of conduct for the Supreme Court." The term limits proposal is 18 years instead of the lifetime appointment now under the Constitution. And he says that each president would appoint a justice every 2 years. The code of conduct would require the justices disclose gifts, not be involved in political activity, and recuse themselves from cases in which they or their spouses have conflicts of interest. In overturning the recent Supreme Court decision recognizing former presidents have some immunity from prosecution for official acts while in office, that would require a constitutional amendment. President Biden traveled to the LBJ Presidential Library in Austin, Texas, to talk about this and mark the 60th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act, which was signed into law by President Lyndon Johnson.
The decision can be boiled down to the title of one case: Trump versus the United States. The court asserted it was making a ruling for the ages. That isn't true. The court made a ruling for one, a former president. No other president in our history has asked for this kind of immunity for criminal actions. And no president, no former president, not me, not one, has and should have been given any exception to this with such immunity. The second thing I'm asking for, we've had term limits for presidents of the United States for nearly 75 years after the Truman administration. And I believe we should have term limits for Supreme Court justices of the United States as well. In fact, the United States is the only major constitutional democracy that gives lifetime seats in their high court. Term limits would help ensure that the court membership changes with some regularity. That would make timing for the court's nomination more predictable and less arbitrary. Reduce the chance that any single presidency imposes undue influence in generations to come. The bipartisan commission I convened analyzed various term limit structures. Based on their report, I believe the best structure is the 18-year term limit. That would help ensure the country would not have what it has now: an extreme court that's the product of an attack on the confirmation process that's been weaponized by those seeking to carry out an extreme agenda for decades to come. By the way, these guys mean it. These guys mean it. Project 2025 is real. They mean it. Third, I'm calling for a binding code of conduct for the Supreme Court. Supreme Court's current ethics code is weak and, even more frightening, voluntary. Any code of Congress must be enforceable. Under the reform I propose, justice would be required to disclose gifts, refrain from public political activity, recuse themselves in cases in which they or their spouses have a financial or other conflict of interest. Most people don't realize that Congress passed a law decades ago that says all federal judges, including Supreme Court justices, have to recuse themselves in such cases. But the current justices insist on enforcing that requirement themselves without any public oversight or compulsion. See, that's their decision. They don't have to tell us how they made it. That might work if the court was actually enforcing those requirements, but they are not. The court is not self-policing. The court is not dealing with the obvious conflicts of interest. We need a mandatory code of ethics for the Supreme Court, and we need it now.
President Joe Biden at the LBJ Presidential Library in Austin, Texas, also there to mark the 60th anniversary of the signing of the Civil Rights Act by former President Lyndon Johnson. Vice President Kamala Harris, the anticipated Democratic presidential nominee this year, putting out a statement in support of the president's Supreme Court changes, writing, President Biden and I strongly believe that the American people must have confidence in the Supreme Court, yet today there is a clear crisis of confidence facing the Supreme Court as its fairness has been called into question after numerous ethics scandals and decision after decision overturning long-term precedent. These popular reforms will help to restore confidence in the court, strengthen our democracy, and ensure no one is above the law. And former President Donald Trump, the Republican presidential nominee this year, posting on his Truth Social platform, the Democrats are attempting to interfere in the presidential election and destroy our justice system by attacking their political opponent, me, and our honorable Supreme Court. We have to fight for our fair and independent courts and protect our country. Some reaction from the U.S. Senate, starting with the Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Democrat from New York.
I believe the president is right to say aloud what many Americans already think. The Supreme Court is a morass. I'm particularly pleased President Biden called for undoing the damage of the court's recent immunity decision. I think Congress should pursue the idea through legislation. I'm working with my colleagues on the best way to proceed. A few years ago, the Supreme Court was easily the most trusted institution in government. But today, confidence in the courts is at an all-time low. For over a year, Americans have learned how some justices have accepted millions of dollars in lavish gifts from right-wing benefactors that at the same time had business before the court. They were funding these groups to pursue their right-wing agenda before the court. And all of this happened in total secrecy and possibly in violation of the law. And at the same time, the MAGA justices have rammed through a flurry of hard right decisions, reversing decades of precedent. They almost seem to ignore it from time to time when they want to. On reproductive freedoms, on affirmative action, on gerrymandering, on administrative law, and so much more. These decisions on choice and so many other issues are way out of the mainstream. Then 1 month ago, the MAGA justices ruled that the President of the United States is in essence above the law when it comes to his official acts. The conservative majority's ruling was the very antithesis of the kind of accountability our framers envisioned.
Senator Chuck Schumer, Democrat from New York, the majority leader on the Senate floor. House Speaker Mike Johnson, Republican from Louisiana, putting out a statement. President Biden's proposal to radically overhaul the Supreme Court would tilt the balance of power and erode not only the rule of law, but the American people's faith in our system of justice. This proposal is the logical conclusion to the Biden-Harris administration and congressional Democrats' ongoing efforts to delegitimize the Supreme Court. This dangerous gambit of the Biden-Harris administration is dead on arrival in the House. And Senator Mitch McConnell, Republican from Kentucky, the minority leader, spoke to this on the Senate floor.
The left wages daily warfare against the justices, illegally picketing their neighborhoods with impunity, trying to harm their spouses' careers, and even spying on what kinds of flags they fly in their yards. Today, the Biden-Harris administration, which desperately wants these radical votes, is once again jumping right into the fray. After talking to a Harvard law extremist who had helped then Senator Biden stage manage the character assassination of Robert Bork almost 40 years ago, they decided the time has come to eliminate the Supreme Court as we know it. In his op-ed, the president says he wants term limits as on justices. Never mind what the Constitution says. Never mind the advice and consent role of the Senate. President Biden and his leftist allies don't like the current composition of the court, so they want to shred the Constitution to change it. He wants what he calls an ethics code, but that already exists. What the president is actually proposing is a stealth process for people other than the justices to decide cases. Again, Constitution be damned. The fact is that President Biden himself came to office and stood up a commission to investigate whether to change the Supreme Court. This morning, the president thanked this commission for its insightful analysis that supposedly informed his reform proposals. Never mind that this commission, co-chaired by one of his closest political confidants, didn't actually recommend that he do anything. On the contrary, it explained in detail the challenges posed by harebrained ideas like term limits. As one of the members noted, quote, "We ought to be really careful about tinkering with the Supreme Court because you just don't know what the consequences could be." Why is the Biden-Harris administration so willing to put the crown jewel of our system of government, the independent judiciary, to the torch? Because it stands in their way.
Senator Mitch McConnell, Republican from Kentucky, the minority leader on the Senate floor. An article at Axios reads that President Biden will make a public and provocative case for dramatic changes to the Supreme Court today, calling for 18-year term limits and a new code of ethics for justices. Joining us now to talk about it is Sam Baker, Axios senior editor. Thanks for being with us. Provocative, dramatic. How would this change the Supreme Court?
Pretty fundamentally. I mean, lifetime tenure on the Supreme Court is one of its defining features. You know, that is what keeps the stakes so high in so many presidential elections. You never know when a justice might die, as we saw very recently with the case of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And justices often, you know, it goes the other way, too, where a justice will retire strategically when a president who shares their ideological persuasion is in the White House. And this would sort of level that out so that as goes the presidency, as would go the ideological makeup of the Supreme Court.
In the Washington Post op-ed that President Biden wrote about this, he said, "I have great respect for our institutions and the separation of powers. What is happening now is not normal, and it undermines the public's confidence in the court's decisions, including those impacting personal freedoms." How would these changes change the relationship between the branches of government?
Yeah, I think this is something that President Biden has been under a lot of pressure to endorse from the left wing of his party, who make the case when they're arguing in favor of changes like this, that the court has sort of become the most powerful branch of government, and that there is very little elected officials can do to sort of, you know, quote unquote, fight back when they don't like what the court does. You know, justices don't stand for election or anything like that. So what they say is sort of final, and elected officials sometimes feel like they're left without any recourse. And so the idea for supporters of changes like this is to sort of bring it more in line with the ebbs and flows of electoral politics.
You mentioned the president under pressure. Why is this announcement coming out now?
That's a good question. You know, he has been under a lot of pressure for a long time. I think that the ruling overturning Roe v. Wade added to that pressure, and then the ruling on presidential immunity seems to have really been a key moment in President Biden getting to this point.
We're talking with Sam Baker from Axios. The other announcement today, proposed constitutional amendment to overturn that Supreme Court decision on presidential immunity. What would it do, and how would that be enacted, or could be enacted?
Well, realistically, none of this is very likely to be enacted. Certainly not a constitutional amendment. The bar to do that is just too high. I think, the bigger import is really sort of the political significance of President Biden doing this. Even though he is now a lame duck president, he has been very resistant to these kinds of changes, these sort of institutional reforms, if you want to call them that, for a lot of his career. And so to see him come out in favor of these things, even in the twilight of his presidency, really does sort of speak volumes to where the political conversation around the court is heading, even if these specific proposals are highly unlikely to ever become law.
What has been the reception from Republicans and Democrats in Congress and the governors?
Republicans in Congress and conservative commentators are unsurprisingly pretty upset with this plan. They, are happy with the current makeup of the Supreme Court, and have said that this, and they're correct about this, that this would be a really dramatic, really fundamental change to the Supreme Court, to the way that it has worked for a long time, and sort of accuse Democrats of being sore losers.
We started by talking about how this was provocative, dramatic. Has this ever been proposed before, something like this?
Well, it's interesting. The same progressives who have been pressuring President Biden to endorse something like this, a lot of them want to go even further, have pushed him to try to pack the court, to add justices to the court, which was, of course, something that FDR attempted to do when the court was hostile to major components of the New Deal. So Biden obviously is not going that far with this, but any movement is still interesting and noteworthy.
Sam Baker, Axios senior editor. Find the stories at Axios.com and on X at Sam_Baker. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Associated Press has an article. The Supreme Court didn't have a formal code of ethics until last year, when the justices adopted one in the face of sustained criticism over undisclosed trips and gifts from wealthy benefactors to some justices, including Clarence Thomas. It still lacks a means of enforcement, something Biden says is common sense. Members of Congress, for example, generally can't accept gifts worth more than $50. Anyone can file complaints against other federal judges who are subject to censure and reprimand. Justice Elena Kagan voiced support for adding an enforcement mechanism to the Supreme Court ethical code in a public appearance last week. That was the article from Associated Press. Justice Kagan was at the 9th Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals Judicial Conference in Sacramento, California.
I think for the most part, the code of conduct that we put out is a good one. I wouldn't have signed on if I didn't think that the essential rules were good rules. And there has been some criticism of those rules, that the rules themselves depart in certain ways from the rules that apply to other judges. But I think that we made good judgments about when those departures were appropriate, given different features of the Supreme Court. So I think that the rules that we put out are good ones. I think that the thing that that can be criticized is, rules usually have enforcement mechanisms attached to them, and this set of rules does not. And I think this is a super hard question, honestly. I think that the enforcers should be judges. I can't think of other people who should enforce a code of conduct as against judges. And I think it would be quite bad, maybe this goes back to the collegiality question, for us to do it to each other. In other words, for the same judges who are sitting around the table trying to decide cases, to be the people who are saying, oh no, you broke that rule or you didn't break that rule. So then what does that leave? I mean, it leaves sort of judges lower down the food chain, and that creates perplexities. It's usually the case that people who enforce rules are not, we review all of your decisions, and then you are kind of reviewing our decisions. And that's not usually the case. And so it does create complications and real questions, and it's a hard thing to do, to figure out who exactly should be doing this and what kinds of sanctions would be appropriate for violations of the rules. But I feel as though we, however hard it is, that we could and should try to figure out some mechanism for doing this. I would be pretty happy with, I have a lot of trust and faith in the Chief Justice. If the Chief Justice appointed some sort of committee of, highly respected judges with a great deal of experience, with a reputation for fairness, that seems like a good solution to me. It would also, benefit us in various kinds of ways, because it would provide a sort of safe harbor. There are sometimes people accuse us of misconduct where we haven't engaged in misconduct. And so I think, both in terms of enforcing the rules against people who have violated them, but also in protecting people who haven't violated them, I think a system like that would make sense. That's one person's view. I am not, you said last year I intimated that we were getting, I'm doing no intimating here.
I was going to ask you that.
Yeah, this is one person's view, and that's all it is.
Supreme Court Justice Elena Kagan at the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals Judicial Conference in Sacramento, California on July 25th. This is Washington Today. The Iowa Capitol Dispatch reports that Vice President Kamala Harris criticized Iowa's abortion ban going into effect in a video released Monday, calling for voters to support her as the presidential candidate in 2024 to preserve abortion access. Iowa's 6-week abortion ban began enforcement at 8 a.m. Monday as a district judge lifted the injunction blocking the law. The measure bans most abortions, with some exceptions, after cardiac activity is detectable in an embryo, something that can happen as early as 6 weeks of gestation. Enforcement was called for in the state Supreme Court ruling in June that set a lower legal standard for assessing abortion law's constitutionality. That was from the Iowa Capitol Dispatch. Vice President Harris expected to be the official Democratic presidential nominee when the Democratic National Committee holds a virtual roll call as soon as August 1st, today posting a video.
Hey, everybody. So today, Iowa put in place a Trump abortion ban, which makes Iowa the 22nd state in our country to have a Trump abortion ban. And this ban is going to take effect before many women even know they're pregnant. And what this means is that 1 in 3 women of reproductive age in America lives in a state with a Trump abortion ban. So what we need to do is vote, because I'm going to tell you something. When I am president of the United States, I will sign into law the protections for reproductive freedom. So let's get this done.
Vice President Kamala Harris, presidential candidate, posting that video today. Minnesota Reformer newspaper, reporting from St. Cloud, former President Donald Trump had new material on Vice President Kamala Harris for thousands of cheering supporters in St. Cloud on Saturday evening at a rally with his running mate, Ohio Senator J.D. Vance. Trump called Harris the likely Democratic nominee for president since President Joe Biden ended his reelection campaign a week ago, a radical left lunatic who supports defunding the police, taking away guns, letting in tens of millions of undocumented immigrants, and limiting red meat. He also said she isn't very smart. Trump also took swings at his other favorite targets: Biden, fake news, radical Islamic terrorism, and violent illegal aliens, whom he compared to Dr. Hannibal Lecter from the horror movie The Silence of the Lambs. Trump added some optimism to his speech, promising an immediate turn of fate for America as soon as he's back in the Oval Office. That was the story from Minnesota Reformer. Here's that point of optimism in the rally.
With our leadership, every disaster Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have created can be fixed, and it can be fixed very quickly. You will be amazed at how quickly it will be fixed. This country will be put back together very soon. Every problem can be solved, and every wrong can be rectified. By this time next year, America's borders will be strong, sealed, and secure. Inflation will be in full retreat. Our economy will be roaring back. Optimism will be surging. The American dream will be thriving again for citizens of every race, religion, color, and creed. Law and justice will reign all throughout our land. You'll be safe again. You'll be free again. Freedom will be restored. The flame of liberty will be burning bright. Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, the worst administration in the history of our country, will be a fading memory of the past. They will be a fading memory.
Former President Donald Trump, Republican presidential candidate, holding a campaign rally in St. Cloud, Minnesota on Saturday. NBC News reports that he has agreed to participate in a victim interview with the FBI focused on his attempted assassination, a Bureau official told reporters Monday. The interview with Trump would be consistent with any interview the Bureau would conduct for any victim of crime under any circumstances, an official said. That was from NBC News. And House Speaker Mike Johnson, Republican from Louisiana, and the House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, Democrat from New York, have announced the 7 Republicans and 6 Democrats who will be serving on a task force to investigate the assassination attempt against former President Trump. The chair is Mike Kelly, Republican of Pennsylvania. His district includes the city of Butler, where the shooting took place, and Congressman Kelly was there at the time. The ranking member on the task force will be Jason Crow, Democrat of Colorado. And the other Republican members, Mark Green of Tennessee, David Joyce of Ohio, Laurel Lee of Florida, Michael Waltz of Florida, Clay Higgins of Louisiana, and Pat Fallon of Texas. And the other Democrats on the task force, Lou Correa of California, Madeline Dean of Pennsylvania, Chrissy Houlihan of Pennsylvania, Glenn Ivey of Maryland, and Jared Moskowitz of Florida. Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer, a Democrat, told CBS Mornings that she expects Vice President Harris to announce her vice presidential running mate in the presidential election in the next 6 or 7 days. Today, John Fortier, American Enterprise Institute senior fellow, spoke about the selection process.
This takes a little bit of time, and in 2016, I think people were worried Donald Trump would pick somebody just on the spur of the moment, not really think about it. He did have a more traditional process then, but by the fact that President Harris is forced to pick a nominee, perhaps not even by the convention, but perhaps by August 7th or early August, when they might have a kind of pre-convention vote. That's a tough period of time. So I think, again, electorally it's probably not going to be the biggest factor, but I do think she is under the gun in a way that other people have not been in the past, and that's probably not an advantage. Most people we're talking about are moderate white guys, moderate white governors, particularly a few moderate white senators. I can say what the betting wisdom is now, but I guess again, given how quickly this has all happened in a short period of time, I don't rule out that it could be somebody different. But people are talking about Senator Mark Kelly from Arizona, Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania, and Tim Walz, the governor of Minnesota. At least the first two being clear swing states that would be very good for Democrats to do well in. Neither of them are super experienced people either. Kelly's been in the Senate for 3.5 years, and Josh Shapiro has been governor for 1.5 years, although was Attorney General for a while before. Others mentioned Roy Cooper, Andy Beshear, J.B. Pritzker, kind of, again, moderate white guys from maybe not so much Kentucky, but certainly from North Carolina, a swing state, so somebody that might look forward to at least help them get into that campaign. But I guess I don't absolutely rule out that she'll go in another direction. Pete Buttigieg, in some ways I see that as unlikely, but it would be a different message. It would be a sort of sending of a kind of the new coalition message, rather than trying to have someone to balance you as well. And then you might note the couple of candidates who seem clearly going to be 2028 candidates, especially if Vice President Harris does not win. One of them, Gretchen Whitmer, is essentially taking herself out of the race. I don't think that would be a terrible choice for her. Maybe Gretchen Whitmer doesn't want to do it, but again, she at least has said that. But sometimes people change their minds. And then Gavin Newsom, who you have this sort of electoral college problem here of 2 people from California. Now that can be gotten around. One person could move. It's not a legal barrier really as much as a rhetorical barrier. But again, I think these are people that you obviously would say would be major Democratic figures potentially running for the nomination in 2028, who probably are not on the list, but maybe in the background. So I will end with that to again say, I think all of us probably have reflected a little bit that we think we're back to where we began before Joe Biden's debate performance. And for the House, I think that absolutely means, again, a very close result, probably favoring the person who wins. And the vice presidential choice, an interesting thing to watch for, and we've got a lot of names, but I don't see that as something that's going to tip the race in any particular way.
John Fortier is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute at a discussion today hosted by AEI on the presidential election. Wall Street today, the Dow down 49, NASDAQ up 12, S&P up 4. Washington today continues in a moment.
As more people cancel cable TV, C-SPAN's funding is at risk. This summer, an anonymous donor has stepped up to help by matching all donations up to $25,000. I'm Caitlin with C-SPAN, and this means your gift will go twice as far. Your donation supports unfiltered access to government and public affairs programming, including the C-SPAN podcasts you value. Visit cspan.org/donate to make your gift today. Every dollar helps us reach our $25,000 goal. Thank you for listening and supporting C-SPAN. Donate today at cspan.org/donate.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast wherever you find your podcasts and on the free C-SPAN Now mobile app. An article from Reuters: Israel wants to hurt Hezbollah but not drag the Middle East into all-out war, 2 Israeli officials said on Monday, as Lebanon braced for retaliation after a rocket strike that killed 12 children and teenagers in the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights. 2 other Israeli officials said Israel was preparing for the possibility of a few days of fighting following Saturday's rocket strike at a sports field in a Druze town that it blamed on the Iranian-backed Lebanese group Hezbollah. Hezbollah has denied any connection with the incident. All 4 Israeli officials, who included a senior defense official and a diplomatic source, spoke to Reuters on condition of anonymity. That was from Reuters. The White House National Security Communications Advisor John Kirby spoke about the situation in a virtual audio news conference today.
We absolutely condemn this weekend's horrific attack in Majd al-Shams that killed a number of children and teenagers playing soccer. Our hearts go out to all the families of those who lost loved ones, and certainly we're praying for a speedy recovery for those who've been hurt. The attack was conducted by Lebanese Hezbollah. Despite their denials, it was their rocket. It was launched from an area that they control. We've been in continuous discussions with our Israeli and Lebanese counterparts, and the United States will continue to support efforts to reach a diplomatic solution along that blue line that will, number one, end these terrible attacks once and for all, and number two, allow Israeli and Lebanese citizens on both sides of the border to safely return to their homes. Our support for Israel's security remains ironclad, and it's unwavering against all Iran-backed threats, including those from Hezbollah. No nation can be expected to tolerate the kind of severe threats that Israel is facing. At the same time, we believe that there is still time and space for a diplomatic solution.
White House National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby in a virtual audio news conference. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, begins an ABC News article, were granted the authority Sunday to decide the manner and timing of a response to the alleged attack by Hezbollah on the town in the Golan Heights, according to the Prime Minister's office. More from the John Kirby briefing. He was asked about why they're confident there will not be an escalation in the fighting.
Our next question will go with Danny Kemp from AFP.
Hi there, and thanks for this. Just on the Hezbollah strike and the situation there, can you give us any further indication or explanation of why you're confident that this isn't going to really escalate, and why you think that those fears that it might are exaggerated? Thanks.
I would just say, Danny, based on the conversations that we've been having, we don't believe that this needs to result in an escalation of a broader war. There's no reason for that outcome to occur. And it also, rather than diminishing our interest in a diplomatic solution around the blue line, I think underscores for us how important those conversations are and need to be going forward, and we're committed to having them. So again, I'll let the Israelis speak to whatever response that they're going to have, but we certainly don't believe that as horrific as this attack was over the weekend, that it needs to result in any kind of escalation or broader risk of a bigger war. Israel has a right to defend itself, as we have said many, many times. That is no less true today than it was last week and the week before that. But that, again, that doesn't mean that we don't believe that means it needs to result in a significant escalation here.
Thanks.
White House National Security Communications Advisor John Kirby during his online audio news conference today. Iran's new president, begins an article at AFP, on Monday warned Israel against attacking Lebanon as tensions soar over a deadly rocket strike in the Israeli-annexed Golan Heights, blamed on Tehran-backed Hezbollah. The president said during a call with French President Emmanuel Macron, according to the Iranian president website, the Zionist regime, or Israel, will make a great mistake with heavy consequences if it attacks Lebanon. From Washington Post, the United States and several Latin American countries cast doubt Monday on claims by Venezuelan elections officials that President Nicolas Maduro won re-election on Sunday and called for transparency in vote counting. Venezuela's National Electoral Council, which Maduro controls, claimed early Monday that he had won 51% of the vote to opposition candidate Edmundo Gonzalez's 44%, despite independent exit polling and partial results that suggested Gonzalez captured twice as many votes as Maduro. That was from the Washington Post. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken saying today the United States is not accepting the announced election result at face value.
If my colleagues will indulge me for just 1 minute, I want to speak quickly to the elections that just took place in Venezuela. We applaud the Venezuelan people for their participation in the July 28th presidential election. We commend their courage and commitment to democracy in the face of repression and in the face of adversity. We've seen the announcement just a short while ago by the Venezuelan Electoral Commission. We have serious concerns that the result announced does not reflect the will or the votes of the Venezuelan people. It's critical that every vote be counted fairly and transparently, that election officials immediately share information with the opposition and independent observers without delay, and that the electoral authorities publish the detailed tabulation of votes. The international community is watching this very closely and will respond accordingly.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken at a news conference in Tokyo, along with Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin and their Japanese counterparts. They were there announcing a joint U.S.-Japan military headquarters led by the U.S. commander in the Indo-Pacific, and also an increase in co-production of air-to-air missiles and air defense interceptor missiles. But the secretary taking the opportunity to talk about the Venezuelan election. Senator Marco Rubio, Republican from Florida, posting on X, Biden and Harris broadly eased Trump's sanctions on Maduro regime as part of a deal for elections in Venezuela. Today was the election, and it was a complete fraud. The latest example of how our enemies have suckered Biden and Harris repeatedly over the last 4 years. The Atlantic Council held a virtual discussion today about the Venezuelan elections. Samantha Schmidt joined them from Venezuela, Bogota bureau chief, Washington Post.
I think it's important to take a step back and remember what was happening just before the results were announced last night as well, here on the ground in Caracas. My colleague, for example, was at one very tense voting center in Caracas where at least 150 motorized, colectivos on motorcycles, pro-government groups started getting into a fight with people outside of the voting center. And you could start to sense the tension rising across the country. Acts of violence, at least one death, it sounds like, at a voting center in Táchira. And, it seemed as though this was going to be a very long and tense night. And we started to hear about allegations of irregularities at voting centers. The opposition started saying that they were being denied printed tabulations printed tallies of the vote, which is crucial, as we now know, to supporting evidence of, potential electoral fraud. And, those witnesses were really crucial to the opposition's effort to try to prevent this kind of thing from happening. And as all that was happening, there was also this delay in the transmission of results to the National Electoral Council. And so that was sort of the where we were at when the results came. And then when they arrived, as Guillermo mentioned, they were so starkly different from the exit polls and so starkly different from the results that the opposition said they had proof of. Even in Caracas, you could, I opened up my window and you could immediately hear the pots and pans, which is the unmistakable sound of protest in Venezuela. And, while there hasn't been, large protest reaction yet, and Maria Corina Machado last night did not, outwardly call for protest. The immediate response was, we need to get all of these actas, all of these voting records, all the tallies from the voting centers. And this morning, I received a memo from the opposition campaign's electoral team, basically laying out their strategy moving forward, which is to demand that the government hand over these records, 30,000 records from polling centers, and not only the online results on a web page, but the actual scanned copies with signatures, with proof that this actually lines up with what the machines counted from the vote last night. And now we've seen the Carter Center, one of the few independent observation missions here, demand these results as well as as you mentioned, all of the different foreign leaders demanding transparency. So there really is a unified response, even from Maduro's friends in the region, such as Brazil and Colombia, demanding proof and receipts of what was announced last night. And, an important thing to mention is the official proclamation from Alves Amoroso today, basically saying Maduro is president for 6 more years. This is official. Sort of, it suggests to us that there's no effort that's going to be made to recount, to reconsider this decision. So very fast-moving situation, but it's definitely a much more. I think that in previous elections we've seen, allegations of electoral fraud and of irregularities, but we were talking about differences of a few percentage points, and the differences here, if true, are much larger than in the past. So this is sort of bringing Venezuela to a whole new place.
Samantha Schmidt, Bogota bureau chief, Washington Post, during a virtual discussion today about the Venezuelan elections hosted by the Atlantic Council. An AP story reads that Nicolas Maduro was formally declared the winner of Venezuela's disputed presidential election Monday, a day after the country's political opposition and the entrenched incumbent both claimed victory in the contest. The National Electoral Council declared Maduro's victory, handing him a third 6-year term. The ministers of Defense, Communications, Technology, and the head of the National Assembly were among those in attendance who applauded. That was from AP. And another AP article, U.S. and Japanese figure skaters finally have a date at the Paris Olympics next week to get their Beijing Winter Games medals, exactly 2.5 years after they earned them in a team event upended by a Russian doping case. Presentation ceremony for skating's team event from February 2022 will be held August 7th at 5 p.m. in Paris, the International Olympic Committee said Monday. The U.S. and Japan placed second and third behind Russia, but no team skating medals were awarded in Beijing because the Russian teenage star Kamila Valieva, within hours, was implicated in a doping case that took almost 2 years to judge. That was from AP. Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass is in Paris for the Olympics, not only to enjoy these games, but to prepare for the 2028 Summer Olympics in her city. On Saturday, she attended a reception to celebrate what's coming in 4 years.
Paris was so gracious, and Mayor Hidalgo was so gracious in showing us around the city, but telling us what we need to do. I know, though, under the leadership of Casey Wasserman, we are going to have a spectacular game in Los Angeles that will acknowledge and lift up all of the cultures and neighborhoods in our cities. I also want to extend my thanks to the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee and our partners again at LA 28. Both are as committed to the vision of what 2028 will be as we are in our city of LA. Since seeing the transformative power of the Olympic movement and sports to unite cities, nations, and people here in Paris, it makes me even more energized for 2028. We know that Angelenos will benefit from the preparation and hosting of the Games, and we want to make sure that every part of our city benefits, from our small businesses to our neighborhoods. And we, in addition to being one of 3 cities to host the Games for the 3rd time, we also in Los Angeles have the legacy of 40 years ago and Mayor Tom Bradley. And if you think about it, it was one of the first times the Games were held that it actually turned a profit. And 40 years later, we are still benefiting from what happened in 1984. And as Casey mentioned, in terms of the traffic, we were all terrified at what traffic was going to be 40 years ago. But I know when we have a Games that is carless, and for LA, we all know that's going to be a challenge, you have to take public transportation in order to get to the Games. And thanks to our federal partners, we will have the resources. And my friend and former colleague in Congress, Senator Coons, we had $200 million approved in the budget for transportation in LA, which will be critical.
Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass, a Democrat, Saturday in Paris at a reception on the 2028 Los Angeles Summer Olympics. Also attending the reception, First Lady Jill Biden. LA has hosted the Olympics twice before, 1932 and 1984, and with this third hosting, that will tie Paris for the most. Paris hosted 1900, 1924, and this year. Story from the Washington Post. Alma Powell, a civic leader and widow of retired General Colin L. Powell, the first black national security advisor, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Secretary of State, died July 28th at a hospital in Alexandria, Virginia. She was 86 years old. In a career mostly as a military spouse, Mrs. Powell also was a children's book author and served on the board of America's Promise Alliance, which focused on civic engagement, education, and workforce development. That was from the Washington Post. C-SPAN 2's Book TV interviewed Alma Powell in 2003 at the National Book Festival in Washington about her book, America's Promise.
This is America's promise to our children. And that was the reason for writing this book, to tell them all what we as America promised to give to them.
Now, this is actually a program also,
This is actually a program that was founded in 1997 after the presidential summit on America's future. All of the living presidents called a summit in Philadelphia to say, what is the future of our children? Because in a country so blessed, far too many of our children are falling through the cracks. And so youth organizations and religious groups and thousands of people came to Philadelphia to talk about what it is our children need. And out of that came the 5 promises.
I wanted to open this up so that our viewers could see this.
Yes.
First one, caring adults in every child's life.
Caring adults in every child's life.
Safe place after school. Healthy start, marketable skills, and opportunities to give back. Talk about the marketable skills.
Well, everybody's got to make a living. And with careers opening up, there's so many things in this world to do. We have to train our children how to do them. We have to teach them that there are more things in this world besides doctor, lawyer, Indian chief, that there are many, many aspects of the workforce that contribute to the quality of life in the United States. And so employers all over the country are participating in our program with Groundhog Shadow Day, which happens in February, where children follow people around. My husband and the current foreign minister of England do an exchange for Groundhog Shadow Day. Young people come from England to the State Department to shadow him, and young people go from here to shadow Jack Straw in London. But one day Sam Donaldson had a kid following him around, but to give them an idea of what careers there are, how the world works, and then to help them have an idea about what it is I can do to contribute to this. Then we got to make sure they've got the education to do it.
Alma Powell in 2003 on C-SPAN 2's Book TV about her book, America's Promise. She has died at the age of 86. Linda Thomas Greenfield, U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, posting on X, deeply saddened by the news of Alma Powell's passing, and unwavering partner to her late husband, former Secretary Colin Powell. She was a passionate supporter of Americans in uniform and the Foreign and Civil Service. Her dedication to a more perfect union will always be remembered. And retired General Barry McCaffrey, who was the head of the Office of National Drug Control Policy under former President Bill Clinton, posting on X, Alma Powell, widow of General Colin Powell, passed on to eternity today. Such a kind, elegant, intelligent woman, a very involved public persona, protective of her family from the terrible racism of her early life to the pinnacles of world leadership, a presence. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. Subscribe to C-SPAN's free evening newsletter word for word. You'll get the stories making headlines in Washington sent to your inbox every day. Sign up at cspan.org/connect. Have a good night.